My name is David, and I want to tell you about the moment I understood that my father's death had paid, quite literally, for the worst betrayal of my life. It was a Thursday afternoon in March, and I was sitting in my car outside Owen's middle school, waiting to pick him up from a robotics club meeting, when I got a call from Halloran and Whitfield, the estate attorney's office that had handled my father's affairs since he died 2 years earlier. The woman on the phone, polite but slightly hesitant, was calling to confirm that the final disbursement had gone through and to ask whether I'd received the closing statement she'd mailed the week before, since it hadn't been returned as undeliverable, but nobody had called to confirm receipt. I told her I hadn't seen any closing statement, and asked what she meant by final disbursement, because as far as I understood, the trust my father had set up, $58,000, earmarked for Owen and Mia's college funds, structured specifically so it couldn't be touched until they turned 18, was supposed to still be sitting untouched, exactly where it had been sitting since his funeral. She paused in a way that told me, before she said another word, that whatever she was about to tell me was going to reorganize something in my life I wasn't prepared to reorganize. The trust was dissolved 14 months ago, she said. Your wife signed the paperwork as co-trustee. The full balance was disbursed to a personal account at that time. I was 44 years old, an insurance claims manager who had spent 20 years training himself to notice inconsistencies in other people's stories for a living, and in that moment, sitting outside my son's school with the engine running, I could not make a single coherent thought connect to the next one. Jennifer was 40, a yoga instructor who taught 3 classes a week at a studio downtown, a woman I had married 15 years earlier because she was the calmest, most grounded person I'd ever met, someone who made a house feel like a home just by being in it. My father, Walter, had died of a stroke 2 years before this call, quickly, mercifully, in his sleep, and in the fog of that grief I had asked Jennifer to help manage the estate paperwork because I genuinely could not look at another form without falling apart, and she had agreed, and I had thanked her, more than once, for taking that weight off me. I had trusted her with my father's money the same uncomplicated way I trusted her with everything else in 15 years of marriage. I want to be honest about that, because it matters for everything that comes after. I never once checked. Not because I was careless with money in general, I wasn't. I managed our regular accounts meticulously, but because this particular fund felt sacred in a way that made checking on it feel almost disrespectful to my father's memory, as if auditing it would be admitting I didn't trust the last thing he'd left behind. I picked Owen up from school 12 minutes later, and he talked the entire ride home about a robot arm that kept dropping its payload, and I nodded and said the right things and had no idea, afterward, what any of it had actually been about. My body drove home. Whatever part of me does the actual living had stayed parked outside that school, turning one sentence over and over. The full balance was disbursed to a personal account 14 months ago. That night, I said nothing to Jennifer. I watched her make dinner, help Mia with a book report, ask Owen about the robot arm with real, specific interest, and I felt the strange, sick vertigo of watching someone perform an entire evening of normal life while some other version of that same evening, the one where she'd emptied my dead father's trust fund and never mentioned it, apparently existed underneath it, invisible, running on its own private logic. I told myself there had to be an explanation. A transfer to a better managed account. A tax restructuring I hadn't been consulted on because I'd made it clear I didn't want to think about it. Some boring, bureaucratic reason that would make this whole afternoon feel foolish in retrospect. I wanted that explanation so badly that I didn't ask her a single question that night, and I want you to sit with that for a second, because it's the first real mistake of this story. I had proof that something enormous had happened without my knowledge, and my first instinct wasn't to ask. It was to protect one more night of not knowing, because some part of me understood, underneath the hope, that whatever this turned out to be, it was going to cost me something I wasn't ready to lose yet. I want to tell you what the weeks after that phone call felt like, because I think anyone who's lived through something like this will recognize the exhaustion of it, the particular fatigue that comes from re-examining every ordinary detail of your own life for hidden meaning, and realizing that most of what you find isn't proof of anything. It's just static, and sorting the static from the signal nearly broke me before I even had a confirmed signal to find. Jennifer's yoga studio, Solace, had expanded its class offerings the previous year, and she'd started teaching an early Tuesday session and a Thursday evening one, on top of her regular Monday-Wednesday-Friday schedule. I remembered being glad about it at the time, glad she had something outside the house that made her feel accomplished, glad the extra income, modest as it was, gave her a sense of independence I'd always encouraged. Looking back now, I understand that gladness had made me careless in a very specific way. I stopped asking follow-up questions about a part of her life I'd already decided was good for her, and decided good for her had somehow become the same thing, in my head, as accounted for. I pulled our joint bank statements the weekend after the phone call, going back 18 months, and it took me most of a Saturday afternoon to understand what I was looking at. The trust disbursement hadn't gone into any account I had access to. It had gone into a separate account, one I'd never known existed, opened the same month as the disbursement, under Jennifer's name alone. From that account, over the following year, money had moved out in patterns that told a story I didn't want to read, recurring charges to a boutique hotel 40 minutes outside Springfield, for figures at a time, roughly twice a month. A leased Audi, registered to a business address I didn't recognize. Payments to something called Ascension Performance Coaching, which, when I searched it, turned out to be the private training brand of a man named Derek Voss, a personal trainer who, according to his own social media, had been running small group sessions out of Solace Yoga Studio for the past year and a half. I remember the exact, physical sensation of scrolling past Derek Voss's name for the first time, a cold drop through my stomach that had nothing metaphorical about it, a real, chemical lurch. I didn't recognize him from anywhere in my life. I recognized him, immediately and completely, from every unexplained charge on that account. If you've ever discovered that a person you trusted completely had built an entire second financial life running parallel to the one you thought you shared, not hidden in some abstract, theoretical way, but hidden specifically, deliberately, behind your dead father's name, you understand something about the particular flavor of that betrayal that's hard to explain to anyone who hasn't lived it. It isn't just the affair. It's the audacity of the container it was funded through. I noticed, over those weeks, things I'd been filing away for months without registering their weight. Jennifer had started wearing a new perfume, something warmer and more expensive than what she usually bought for herself, and when I'd complimented it once, she'd said a client had gifted it to her, plausible, forgettable, exactly the kind of small lie designed to cost nothing if it's never questioned. She'd started locking her phone with a passcode 6 months earlier, something she explained as, "Mia keeps getting into my photos," which had seemed reasonable at the time because Mia genuinely did get into everyone's phones. She'd begun leaving for her Tuesday early class nearly 40 minutes before she needed to, something I'd attributed to traffic without ever once checking whether Tuesday traffic actually required that. I want to stop here for a second, because this is the moment I think about most when I try to explain how I missed something this large. It wasn't one enormous lie. It was dozens of small, individually forgivable half-truths, a perfume, a passcode, a departure time, each one costing nothing on its own, each one stacking quietly on top of the last until they built something I couldn't see the size of until I finally stood back far enough to look at the whole structure at once. Owen, meanwhile, had started asking why Mom seemed happier on the days she taught yoga than on the days she didn't. I told him some jobs make people feel more like themselves. He accepted that the way 13-year-olds accept most adult explanations, with a shrug, but I noted, distantly, that he'd noticed something too, in the sideways, half-formed way kids notice things before they have language for what they're seeing. By early April, I had confirmed, through the account records alone, that at least $40,000 had moved from the trust account into Derek Voss's orbit over the previous 14 months, the car lease, the hotel charges, the coaching payments that had nothing to do with any workout regimen I'd ever seen Jennifer follow. I hadn't confronted her. I hadn't even hinted that I knew anything was wrong. I told myself I needed more information before I said a word, and that was true, but underneath it was something less rational. I understood that the moment I spoke, everything about my marriage would become retroactively different, and some stubborn, wounded part of me wanted to stay in the last few days of not knowing for exactly as long as I could stand it. I found Derek Voss's face for the first time on a Wednesday evening, scrolling through Solace Yoga's public class schedule and staff photos, and something in my chest went very still when I saw him, dark hair, the deliberate, unhurried confidence of a man who'd built his whole personal brand around being looked at. I sat with my laptop open on the kitchen counter for a long time after that, listening to Jennifer's car in the driveway before she came in from her Wednesday evening class, and I remember thinking, with a clarity that surprised me, I already know everything I need to know. I just don't have her voice yet. I want to be honest about what I did next, because it isn't a decision I'm proud of, but it's the truth of how this story continued. I drove to the hotel 40 minutes outside Springfield on the following Tuesday, her early class day, and parked across the street in the lot of a shuttered diner, and waited, the way you wait when you've already decided what you're going to see and are only confirming the shape of it. At 9:40 that morning, Jennifer's car pulled into the hotel's side lot, the one without a front desk sightline. 11 minutes later, Derek Voss's leased Audi, the same one on the bank statements, plate confirmed, pulled in beside it. I sat in that parking lot for nearly 2 hours. I did not go inside. I did not confront anyone in a hotel hallway like some man in a movie who's finally found his nerve. I drove home, picked Mia up from school at the usual time, helped her practice spelling words at the kitchen table, and some part of me sat very still in that parking lot the entire evening, refusing to move, refusing to fully believe what I'd already confirmed with my own eyes. She told me, much later, what that particular morning actually felt like from her side, though I had no idea at the time. I remember the drive there that day thinking, if David ever finds out about the money before he finds out about Derek, I don't know which one will actually be worse for him. I'd stopped being able to separate the two in my own head months earlier. The affair and the money had fused into one single act of taking, and by that point I wasn't lying to myself about the affair anymore, only about the money, telling myself that Walter would have wanted his grandkids' mother to be happy, that happy mothers raised better children, that somehow this justified using a dead man's trust to fund a life he never knew existed. I believed that logic completely some mornings. Other mornings I could that had nothing to do with the affair itself and everything to do with what I'd taken to get there. That's what she told me. I knew none of it yet, sitting in that diner parking lot with my hands steady on the wheel and my whole life quietly rearranging itself. I began, over the following 2 weeks, doing something I never imagined I'd become capable of, building a case against my own wife with the same methodical patience I used at work to unravel fraudulent claims. I pulled the estate attorney's full disbursement paperwork, which showed Jennifer's signature as co-trustee on a form authorizing early dissolution due to unforeseen medical necessity, a category, the attorney later confirmed, that required no documentation beyond a signed attestation, which meant Jennifer had simply written the words and no one had questioned them, because grieving families aren't usually audited on the specifics of their pain. I found the lease agreement for the Audi, co-signed under a business name, JK Wellness Consulting, that Jennifer had apparently registered the same month as the trust dissolution, giving the entire arrangement a thin, plausible skin of legitimacy that would collapse the moment anyone looked past its surface. I found, going back through 18 months of hotel charges, that the total came to just under $9,000 on its own, separate from the car and separate from the roughly $22,000 paid out under the Ascension Performance Coaching label, payments for a coaching relationship that, as far as I could determine, had never produced a single verifiable client session, a single receipt for equipment, a single trace of an actual professional service. I want to stop here for a second, because this is the heaviest part of those 2 weeks, and I don't think I've said this out loud to anyone before. There was a night, about 10 days before everything broke open, when I sat on the edge of our bed after Jennifer had fallen asleep, and I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in longer than I want to admit, and felt something close to tenderness, even knowing everything I knew by then. Some of you have been here too, I think. That strange, useless love that doesn't switch off just because it should. I didn't wake her up. I didn't say anything. I just sat there in the dark, holding my father's name in my hands, not ready yet to put it down. I called Derek Voss directly, the following Thursday, from a number he wouldn't recognize. He answered on the second ring, sounding immediately wary the moment I gave him my real name. I asked him, flatly, how long he'd known my wife. There was a long pause, and then he said, "I think you need to talk to Jennifer about this," and hung up before I could say anything else. That silence told me everything a confession would have. A man with a clean conscience doesn't hang up on a stranger's first question. By the time I had everything organized, the disbursement paperwork, the lease agreement, the coaching payments, the hotel charges, the parking lot confirmation, Derek's own guilty silence. I understood I had built, without ever meaning to become the kind of man who builds such things, a complete and irrefutable account of exactly how my father's final gift to his grandchildren had been converted into an affair. I laid it all out on the kitchen table one Saturday morning, once both kids were at Owen's grandmother's for a sleepover, and I looked at the folder for a long time before I let myself go find Jennifer. I chose that Saturday because I couldn't stand carrying it for one more day. I didn't warn her about what was coming. I wanted, for once in this entire ordeal, to control the moment instead of absorbing it. I didn't ease into it. I laid the disbursement paperwork on the kitchen table the second Jennifer walked in from her morning class, still in her workout clothes, a towel around her neck, and I said, "Explain to me why my father's trust fund doesn't exist anymore." She went completely still for a second. I watched it happen, the exact moment her body understood what her mind hadn't caught up to yet, and then something in her seemed to decide, all at once, that stillness wasn't going to work as a strategy. "You want to talk about money," she said, her voice already rising, "when you've been checked out of this marriage for 3 years? When was the last time you actually looked at me, David? When was the last time you asked how I was doing instead of asking about your father's precious paperwork?" I placed the lease agreement on top of the disbursement forms. "This is a car. Under a fake consulting business. Paid for with Owen and Mia's college money." "It's not fake," she said, too fast, too loud. "I do wellness consulting. You don't know anything about my career because you've never once asked." I placed the hotel charges next, one on top of another, 6 months of them fanned across the table like a hand of cards nobody wanted to be holding. Ascension Performance Coaching. Derek Voss. I called him, Jennifer. He told me to talk to you. That was the moment the fight stopped being contained. She grabbed the papers off the table and threw them, not at me, just into the air between us, a small, furious gesture that scattered them across the kitchen floor, and she was shouting now, about how I'd stopped seeing her the year Owen was born, about how I'd disappeared into my job the same year my father got sick, about every unresolved grievance from 15 years of marriage arriving in the room at once, the vacation we never took, the fight about her mother we'd never actually finished having, the years she'd felt invisible in her own house while I congratulated myself on being a good provider. I shouted back. "I want to be honest about that, because it matters. I wasn't calm through any of this." I told her she'd stolen from her own children to fund an affair with a man half her substance, that she'd used my father's death as a mechanism, that whatever legitimate pain she'd been carrying about our marriage could not, explain what she'd actually done with $58,000 that wasn't hers to spend. She screamed that I'd made her feel like a piece of furniture in her own home for years, that Derek had made her feel like a person again, that if I'd ever once really looked at her none of this would have happened. We were both standing now, both louder than either of us had ever been with each other in 15 years, old wounds surfacing faster than either of us could name them, my mother's disapproval of Jennifer early in our marriage, a miscarriage we'd never really talked through, the year I'd worked 80-hour weeks and missed most of Mia's first year. Every unaddressed resentment we'd been quietly storing found its way into that kitchen at once, and for a while, the affair itself became almost secondary, buried under 15 years of things neither of us had said out loud until we were screaming them. We stopped at the exact same moment, both of us, mid-sentence, because we both heard it simultaneously, the sound of Mia's bedroom door easing open upstairs, the particular creak of the third step, and we both remembered, in the same half-second, that the kids' bedroom wall backed directly onto the kitchen, and that Mia had come home early from her sleepover with a stomachache 20 minutes before Jennifer's class ended, and neither of us had processed that she was in the house at all. The silence that followed was more complete than anything either of us had shouted. I understood, standing there with my chest still heaving, that whatever this marriage had been, it had just ended in front of our 9-year-old daughter, whether or not either of us had meant for that to happen, and that understanding landed harder than any single piece of evidence I'd gathered over the previous month. I want to name something here that I only recognized clearly in that silence. I had spent years being good at exactly the wrong things in this marriage, working hard, providing well, avoiding conflict at almost any cost, and somewhere inside all that avoidance, I had stopped being someone Jennifer felt she could actually bring her loneliness to. That didn't make what she did with my father's money forgivable. It never would. But it explained, in a way I hadn't let myself see until that fight finally forced it out of both of us, exactly what kind of hole she'd gone looking to fill, and I owed myself the honesty of recognizing that even in the worst moment of my marriage. Jennifer went upstairs first, to check on Mia, and I stood alone in the kitchen surrounded by scattered papers, understanding that the version of my marriage that had existed that morning no longer existed, and that whatever came next would have to be built, or ended, from the wreckage of exactly what had just happened in that room. Jennifer moved into her sister's guest room 3 days after the fight, once we'd agreed, at least, that the kids needed stability more than either of us needed to keep sleeping under the same roof while we figured out what came next. She called most evenings, and for the first week, I could hear her still trying to manage the story, softer framing, smaller numbers, careful phrasing designed to narrow what had happened back down to something survivable. I stopped answering some of those calls. Not out of cruelty. Because I needed, eventually, to hear a version of the truth that wasn't shaped for my comfort, and I understood she wasn't going to give me that version while she still believed there was something left to save through careful management alone. She finally gave it to me on a Thursday evening, on our back porch, 3 weeks after the fight, after asking if she could come by to talk without the kids around. She finally spoke. This is what she told me, in her own words, that night. It started the week after Walter's funeral. Derek was teaching a grief recovery series at the studio, and I signed up because I genuinely didn't know what else to do with myself. He asked how I was really doing, and actually waited for the answer, and I hadn't felt that from anyone, not from you, not from my own sister, since before Walter got sick. I told myself getting close to him didn't count as anything, because it started as grief, and grief felt like it should be exempt from the normal rules. The first time I signed the early dissolution paperwork, I told myself it was temporary, that I'd move the money into a better account and put it right back once I found a good financial advisor. That was the lie that let me do it the first time. I never moved it back. Every month I didn't, it got easier to justify the next thing I spent it on, because I'd already crossed the line that mattered, and everything after that felt like a smaller version of the same crime. I was terrified of you finding out, obviously, but underneath that fear was something worse. I was terrified of going back to feeling like a fixture in my own house, and some part of me decided that fear was bigger than my fear of losing everything. I couldn't look at Owen's college fund statements without feeling sick, so I stopped opening them. I stopped opening most of my mail, actually, because so much of it was evidence of what I was becoming. I'm not telling you this to make it smaller, David. I'm telling you because you deserve the actual shape of it, not the version I kept trying to give you in that kitchen. That's what she told me. I finally had the whole shape of it, months after I'd started needing it. I didn't say much that night. I told her I appreciated her finally saying it plainly, and that I needed time before I could tell her what came next. She nodded and left without pushing, which I understood, by then, as its own small, belated kind of respect. The divorce took 11 months. I retained a forensic accountant who traced every dollar of the $58,000, and the estate attorney's records. Jennifer's own signature on the early dissolution paperwork made the financial case almost unarguable in court. I was awarded primary custody, the house, and the majority of our remaining shared assets, and the judge ordered Jennifer's share of the settlement to restore what could be restored to Owen and Mia's college funds, though restoring a number on paper never quite restores the thing my father actually meant to give them. I think about that Saturday morning phone call sometimes, sitting outside Owen's school, and how completely certain I'd been, right up until the moment the attorney said, 14 months ago, that my father's last gift to his grandchildren was the one part of my life too sacred for anyone to touch. I understand now that sacredness isn't the same thing as safety, and that the things we refuse to check on, out of respect or love or simple exhaustion, are often exactly the things that need checking most. The cruelest detail in this whole story isn't the $58,000, or even the least Audi with its thin legal disguise. It's that Jennifer's affair began at my own father's funeral reception, in a grief recovery class meant to help her heal, taught by the man who would eventually help her spend his grandchildren's future. Betrayal rarely announces itself as betrayal. It arrives disguised as exactly the kind of care a person is starving for, offered by someone willing to provide it without asking what it might cost everyone else standing just outside the frame. What this story revealed to me over time wasn't really about the money at all, or even about Derek Voss. It was about how completely a marriage can hollow out while both people keep performing its outward shape. I provided. I avoided conflict. I called that peace. Jennifer performed contentment for years while quietly starving for something I'd stopped offering, and neither of us said a single honest word about it until 15 years of unspoken resentment finally detonated in a kitchen, in front of our daughter, on the same day I confronted her with a stranger's leased car. The way the fight unfolded, both of us shouting, both of us dragging in old wounds neither of us had ever properly closed, matters more than it might seem. It means the affair was never really an isolated event. It was the visible symptom of a much older, much quieter erosion, one that had been running underneath both of our lives for years before either of us had the courage or the cruelty to say so out loud. My father's trust fund didn't cause any of this. It simply happened to be sitting there, sacred and unguarded, at the exact moment two exhausted, resentful people needed somewhere convenient to hide from each other. I don't know if there was ever a version of us that could have survived even a smaller version of this. What I know is that the man who refused to check on his father's trust fund out of respect for his father's memory had to disappear for me to build anything honest going forward, with Owen and Mia or with anyone else. Losing that man is, strangely, the part of this story I grieve least. If there's one thing I'd want someone listening to this to sit with tonight, it's this: the things we love most fiercely are sometimes the exact things we protect ourselves from ever actually examining. I didn't check my father's trust fund because checking felt disrespectful. It turns out silence can be its own kind of disrespect too, to him, to our kids, and eventually to myself.